Well, you know what? We're going without the intro today. We're just going to go live because we are live now.
Well, good evening and welcome to Explorers, Seekers of the Truth, All Hallows Eve special. Tonight we're going to talk about some of the more classic Halloween monsters. Also, kids, we promise no razor blades in our candy. Of course, that's a joke for people our age because, does anybody remember those stories? And
I
by the
do.
way, tonight I'm joined by my best friend and co-host, Lesson Cabbage. How are you doing tonight, buddy?
I am good. Thank you, my friend. Ladies and gentlemen, the lovely and voluptuous Chad Charlesworth. Thank you for that introduction, my friend. As always, as you know from our previous shows, we like to let everybody know where and how they could get in touch with us. You could go to www.explorersgroup.com at our website. You could check that out, learn more about us and what we do, as well as get in contact with us through there, watch old shows and some evidence that we have from previous investigations. You could also go to facebook.com/explorers to check out our Facebook page, which is where you're watching us from right now. And you can also get in touch with us at Twitter at Explorers Group. That is our little handle there. Also, as the show goes on today, Be Live has a nifty feature that as you comment under the video on Facebook, it'll automatically populate. Oh, look, there's Charlie Connor. I heard the razor blade stories growing up. Yeah, there you go. So you get it too. As you can see, Charlie commented via Facebook. We see it on Be Live, so we could comment back and forth. So Charlie, thanks for joining in, buddy. Or we're glad to see you here. So yeah. So tonight we're going to be talking about the three big classic Halloween monsters. We have vampires, witches, and werewolves on the docket for tonight. We're going to give a little bit of history of each one of those and a little bit of what the folklore is, what the possibility or reality is, and just kind of a little bit of history of those throughout their span from back in the day until now. So, Chad?
Yeah, I think we've all, over the years as kids had dressed up as either a vampire, a witch, a werewolf for Halloween. So, Les, can you give us a little history on the holiday itself?
Yeah, the history of Halloween, according to many scholars, All Hallows Eve is a Christianized feast originally influenced by Western European harvest festivals, and is also well, it's the night before Christmas, All Hallows Eve, and Halloween is or Samhain, depending on how you reference it or what you believe in. It's the holiday where it's believed that the veil between the living and the dead is at its thinnest. And some say that it is the time of year where family members or people that have passed away have the ability to kind of come back and visit with those loved ones that are still living. And as we said before, it's a festival of the dead with possible pagan roots, particularly the Celtic Samhain, as I had mentioned before. The word Halloween was first used in the 16th century and represents a Scottish variant of the fuller All Hallows Eve.
Huh.
And there you
So
have it.
again, so what you're telling us again is that we have another Christian holiday that was positioned alongside a pagan holiday during the early days.
Absolutely, yes. Much like everything, Christianity had kind of tailored or stolen from most earthbound or pagan religions and stuff like that to kind of either scare away or draw people into the acceptance of Christianity. Yeah, fun stuff. But yeah. What? Oh God, I'm losing track of thought already. Sorry, or train of thought. But All Hallows Day was introduced in the year 609, but was originally celebrated on May 13th. In 835, it was switched to November 1st, same day as Samhain, at the behest of Pope Gregory IV.
Yeah, you tend to see a lot of the holidays. The church used the more classic group that they were entering into Christianity. They used a lot of the same dates as those cultures already had established holidays, basically to make the conversion to Christianity a lot easier for those people. Christmas is one of those holidays, Easter. They basically positioned themselves along a lot of pagan festivals, which helped with the conversion to early Christianity. So, not knocking Christianity, it's just a very smart tool for the conversion of people to a group, is to assimilate them using their own holidays or their own times a year and still celebrating a piece of that holiday, even though it's given another name and another connotation. It's still a good way of converting people at this point.
Well, yeah, it's using what's familiar to your advantage, and like you said, it is a smart move. So let's get to the heart of the show, and let's start with vampires.
Where? I didn't see any lawyers.
No, Chad. What can you tell us about the legendary monster, a vampire?
Well, I'm pretty sure we don't have any lawyers listening to us. Probably better odds on vampires listening to us than lawyers. Just how life goes. But as a lot of you guys know, I'm big in Greek mythology. So, of course, you give me the opportunity to present mythology on vampires. I'm going to go to the Greeks. The first story is basically typical Greek mythology. It's basically about a young Italian man, Ambrogio, and the love of his life, Selena. And the story, basically goes, Ambrogio comes to the legendary oracle at Delphi, the temple of Apollo, who was the sun god in Greek mythology, and he sees this beautiful girl and decides to ask her to marry him. Well, little did he know that Apollo had wanted her as his own. So he cursed Ambrogio. The curse basically caused his skin to burn whenever it was exposed to sunlight. So in desperation, Ambrogio turns to Hades. For people who don't follow Greek mythology, Hades is the god of the underworld. Hades, a lot of times people will use Hades in place of hell. It's basically the same concept in Greek mythology as it is in Christianity. And basically, he made a deal with Hades that he had to steal Artemis, the goddess of the hunt. He had to steal her silver bow to fulfill his deal with Hades. By stealing the bow, Artemis cursed Ambrogio, so that anytime he came in contact with silver, it would burn his skin. And basically it goes on. She later took pity on him, and kind of in typical Greek mythology, when the gods take pity on a human, the consequences aren't exactly what the human would want. So she blessed him with super strength and immortality, fangs, the basic fangs to kill beast, so he could write love poems with the blood to his lovely Selena. Selena eventually escapes Apollo's grasp. They reunite, and Artemis tells Ambrogio he can make Selena immortal by drinking her blood, which will cause her human body to die off, but her spirit to live on. Combination of their blood will turn anybody who drank it into a vampire. And of course, that's one early interpretation of the vampire mythos. Another, of course, is the traditional Dracula, Vlad the Impaler, Vlad Dracul, which is basically Count Dracula is a creation of Bram Stoker. with the use of Vlad Dracul, known as Vlad in Romania, it's Vlad Tepes, which is the Impaler. He was born in Transylvania. He was the ruler of what's called Wallachia in Romania, and it was off and on from about 1456 to 1462 that he was the ruler. Basically, depending on how you look at Vlad's military exploits, some would describe him as this brutal, cruel leader. Others would say how valiantly he fought off the the Ottoman Turks. He earned the nickname the Impaler by how he liked to display and kill off the enemies after they were captured. And basically what they would do is take a spike, insert it next to the anus, and then run it up the human body along the spinal column. Now, not piercing the spinal column because that would kill them, but next to the spinal column and basically running it out the meaty part right here in between your spinal column and your neck. So that was where he kind of got the whole, Vlad the Impaler thing. Mm-hmm. Now, what happens is you start to develop legends. You start to develop the legend of Vlad Dracul, where, basically people saying about him dining amongst the victims and dipping his bread into the water or into the blood and eating it as the people are on wood stakes around him. Now, of course, these are all stories that come from his enemies and later on stories. They're not told while he's alive. So a lot of times with this is where some people feel Bram Stoker got the idea for the vampire using blood and the wooden stake to kill a vampire. Would have been similar to Vlad's method of impaling his, fallen victims. Mm. So now, if you take a modern view on Vlad's style, I always look at he was a great military leader. He defended his people and he defended Christianity from an invasion of the Muslim Turks. They were bent on world conquest and conversion, to the beliefs of the Muslim religion. And Vlad used impaling of the enemies as psychological warfare. Similar to, propaganda used in the wars ever since. It showed a willingness and a level that he was willing to go to defend his homeland and his people from an invasion. Agree with it or not, it had to be a sight. You come into this area and all you see is 5,000 people slowly sliding down a post that's coming out next to their head and starts around their anus. So, I had to play hell with the enemy's minds. So, Les, tell us how you become a vampire.
Well, first off, I just want to. I think there's a bug in my freaking headphones. It's driving me nuts. Oh, I like the skeletons on there too, Alicia. Thanks for noticing, your wife. But one thing that I had noticed is in a lot of these stories that we look up and we research and stuff like that. Did you ever notice that the cause of every man's trouble and the torture and the demise always has to do with a woman? And how things never change. I tell you what. Ay, ay, ay. And Vlad the Impaler, that whether it be true or not, legend or lore, to see someone sitting there dining amongst the impaled enemies, blood dripping down as you're feasting, if that were true, that would be enough to want to keep somebody away from them. I tell you what.
I think that's all on perception. I really think it started out with one of those things where, it's a battlefield, you're in camp, you impale those bodies in an area where people can see it.
Mm-hmm.
Now you bring out all your generals and you put a table in the middle of all this. So your enemy is still within eyesight of all this.
Mm-hmm.
And they see you sit down to eat. I think a lot of the stories become overblown over the years that he was dipping his bread in blood and eating it. I don't think that's necessarily true, but I think it's all, it's all psychological at that point. You've now basically shown these people, like, look, there is no quarter given. You're invading my homeland.
Right.
I will do this to any one of you to defend my people. So, yeah, I think sometimes it's just it's overblown psychology, and the stories get to be greater than they really were.
Right. Well, as you had asked me before, how do you become a vampire? Well, to become a vampire, a ritual that is consistent with earlier legends of vampires, where basically a human has to drink the blood of a vampire, or in some cases they'd be bitten to the point where they're almost dead. And in order for them to save their lives, or in order for the vampire to almost assure that you will agree to his request of becoming a vampire, or her request, whatever, I don't want to be biased, you would have to drink the blood of the vampire. And later legends say that all future vampires, like if you were bitten by, like, the originator or the lead vampire, every vampire that was created afterwards by that one, I guess, could be destroyed at that point too. So if the original vampire were destroyed, everyone underneath him would be destroyed. But that's what I hear. But anyways, later legends say that all future vampires that were created by the person you had talked about before that, Ambrosio, by the same ritual, he'll drink the blood of humans, which would mix with his own and Celine's. The vampire would then bite his own wrist, and the human would have to willingly drink the mixed blood in order to become a real vampire. So like I said, and a lot of times the vampire would get the human to the point where they're almost dead, and as it's basically a given, you're not going to want to die, you're going to want to take whatever option is available to survive, so you would drink from the vampire. So what about what do you know about feeding myths and whatnot?
Basically the ongoing myth, and again, remember folks, this is a loose interpretation of folklore and legend being presented. Basically the idea of feeding is unlike that of humans, seeing that they don't need food for subsistence. In order for the body to digest food would be kind of repulsive in their area of thought. And basically what it is the blood is actually ingested and absorbed directly into their own bloodstream, which basically, thinking about fresh blood is needed for their survival. It allows them to regenerate, from wounds or anything like that. It acquires, it actually keeps their flesh alive, since they are essentially dead creatures or undead creatures, or somewhere in that middle ground of not quite alive, not quite dead. Their bodies are naturally decaying, so fresh blood moves through their body, allows their flesh to stay alive. Basically they, kind of always put it in that they only need to feed a couple times a week in order to maintain their health. If they were wounded, they would need to eat more often for the healing process. Now, here's the weird thing that they kind of claim in the vampire folklore: as they get older, less blood is required to maintain normal functionality. Um, that doesn't really make sense to me because the flesh would be dying because the flesh would be a lot older and, being not alive, it would already be, decomposing at a faster rate the longer, watch kind of a reference point. If you watch Walking Dead from season 1 to now, the zombies are more and more decayed as the series goes on. That would be similar to the same process that the vampire would be living through.
Mandy, of course.
Yes, of course they do, Mandy.
Actually, we got a question from our lovely audience. Do vampires have sex? Yes, actually, sex is one of the biggest lures that vampires use to attract, in particular, willing females or unwilling females. They put them in a trance with their sexual dance, and they get them in there, and they have their way and end up either killing or converting. So yes, vampires do have sex, and that's why they need that fresh blood to get everything going.
Yeah, and actually, in a lot of older cultures, the life essence of a human was in the sexual potency and sexual reproductive organs. People have heard of succubus and incubus. It's kind of along the same lines. They drain the life force out of a person through sexual means, which is basically a form of vampire. Whether it's succubus, incubus are considered completely different, entities, but they're basically energy vampires. They're using the reproductive system as a way to drain the life out of the living.
Well, one of the things I wanted to kind of talk about before Mandy interjected there with her ongoing interest of necrophilia is you were saying about how the vampires, the older they get, the slower the body or the less blood is required because the body is slower to decay. Think of it kind of in a reverse process. When a human is first turned, they're essentially dead. Their body is dying. So initially, their body wants to start breaking down naturally. So in a way, you would kind of require more blood in the beginning to keep the body vital. You know what I mean? And as the body adapts and the body changes as time goes on, it wouldn't require so much because it's almost either kind of evolved itself or adapted itself to not needing blood as a life source. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So, go ahead.
I don't know. To me, that just doesn't necessarily hold on because the longer something goes, it's obsolescence. It's the human body is only made to last so long.
Right, but you got to remember though, they're the undead. They're not dead, but they're not living, and they're supernatural at that point, if you will, because they almost invoke or then start to possess those supernatural powers.
Are we seriously debating the vampire long-term life goal plan here?
Yes, yes, we are. Are you still stuck on the vampire sex topic?
Yeah, I mean,
Andy, you threw us off.
No, I can see what you're saying because the longer they are in the vampire, state, the more vampiristic they become. So therefore, the less requirement for nourishment. But that almost makes me think of the Stolios, the Romanian folklore about what real vampires are. Mm-hmm. They're actually a monster.
Oh God, Twilight,
folks.
They don't sparkle. They don't. Yeah. According to Twilight, Alicia, really, they don't sparkle.
Vampires don't sparkle. But yeah, there's a Romanian folklore about these monsters that are basically I think Bram Stoker's Dracula from like the 90s, the whitish creature bat thing he becomes at points. Basically, those running around the woods of Romania, attacking animals for blood.
Well, don't
So,
forget, as we will discuss further on in the show when we get into the werewolf topic, it's also kind of part with the shape shifting, almost skinwalker kind of persona where vampires could take shape of wolves as well in order to go out and hunt. You know what I mean? So they wouldn't be identified really as a beast; they'd be identified as an identifiable beast, as like a wolf, rather than like you said, those creatures that are represented in Bram Stoker's movie.
stovetop stuffing. What?
Strokers.
Stroker Ace was born to race.
So let's move on to the most important of the vampire mythology, which is how to kill them. There are many different ways on how to kill a vampire, as the classic ones, except for Twilight, Alicia, so you're safe, is exposing them to sunlight where they will basically turn to dust or ash, because as you had said in the original from the Greek mythology, they were cursed, so that way when they are exposed to sun, it'll burn their flesh. So exposure to sunlight, and of course the traditional wooden stake to the heart or silver stake to the heart, because again, just like werewolves, excuse me, vampires are also affected by exposure to silver. And in the Saxon regions of Germany, and this one Chad and I were talking about earlier, and this I didn't think about it, but it's actually kind of makes sense. Is in the German Saxon region, a lemon was placed in the mouth of a suspected vampire, and tell everybody about kind of what we were talking about before. I thought it was kind of cool.
Yeah, we were discussing, if you think when people reference the sun, it's always like, if you, as weird as it sounds, the Pearl Jam lyrics, Lemon Yellow Suns from Jeremy, sun-kissed oranges. We always think in like citrusy type fruits, your orange, your lemons. Were they almost references to like the sun, the power of the sun against the vampire on Earth would be, the use of a lemon or an orange due to the colors that they had. And it just seemed, we were kind of talking about it earlier, it just kind of seemed like an interesting, why a lemon of all things. The only thing we could really come up with was the lemon yellow, reference
fruit,
to the sun.
yeah.
Citrus
fruits are sun fruits. They can only grow in tropical areas where there's an abundance of sunlight, and the more sun, the bigger they grow and the better they grow. So like you said, essentially it's the sun of the earth, or the physical sun of the earth, so
yeah.
it kind of makes sense if you think about it, that a sun fruit would kill a vampire.
Hold on, what was that? You're a fruit?
Yes. But I don't know. I think it makes sense. It's kind of an interesting theory I've never heard of before.
Well, that's basically because I came up with it as we were doing research.
And I never heard of it before.
Well, it's because it was brand new.
And I never heard of it before. All right, moving along. So we covered a little bit about vampires, a little bit of the history, and a little bit of how one could turn, how one could be destroyed. So now we're going to move on to one of the next biggies of the Halloween monsters. We're going to start talking about witches. And yes, witches. This topic holds a very special place in my heart, as I've been fascinated by the idea or the possible reality of such magical beings. Not necessarily the ugly old hags as seen in so many books and in the movies over the years, but just the idea in general of a person having the ability to manipulate their surroundings by the use of like a universal or higher power that they can unlock within their own human psyche. I can remember, I think I was in 6th grade when I first started researching and studying what at the time was a newer or taboo religious movement known as Wicca, also referred to as witchcraft. Now, keep in mind, I said studied, not practice. I wasn't trying to be a witch. I just I wanted to educate myself rather than be, ignorant and say, well, it's different from what I believe in, therefore it's either stupid, bad, or the like. I would prefer to understand something before I reject something. But because I was raised Catholic and I do believe in God and all that, but I have also been a curious person and I try to educate myself in other religions and beliefs. So now I'm going to step off of my soapbox and get back to the show.
Well, thank God for that, because, I could just hear the town folks of your area, lighting up their torches and getting their pitchforks and heading in your direction. So
Wouldn't
it was
take
around,
much.
around there. It's probably better than around here.
Yeah.
You sneeze in the wrong way, they dunk you in the water to see if you float. So it was around 560 BC in that area. It's referenced in the Old Testament, the condemnation of witches. Even up until today, historically, witchcraft has been described as working with the devil. Basically, if that person was a witch, they would have made a pact with the devil, to give them the ability to perform black magic. It's also thought that black cats were the devil in animal form and would converse with the witches on carrying out his evil doings. There's many arguments about witches following 560 BC, and basically what happens is each statement contradicts the other, basically because people feared anything outside of what they considered normal. We still live in a society that does this. A society does run on order and not chaos. Therefore, anything different was considered witchcraft. And that, when you think about that, a lot of times, anything different, people who didn't necessarily buy into Christianity 100% would have been considered practicing witchcraft. You now have all these offshoot religions. You have, your Jewish mysticism, the Kabbalah or whatever it was that Madonna joined years ago. Technically, that's witchcraft in a lot of people's eyes. So it's one of those things, to avoid mass hysteria, chaos, trials were conducted to, eradicate the quote problem. So with that, what is a witch? A witch is this is also one of the things we always think of witches as women per se, but it's basically a man or a woman that is thought to have magical powers, especially evil ones. Popular depictions of them always wearing black cloaks, pointed hats, and flying on broomsticks.
Well, it's funny because the popular representation of the pointed hat, dressed in all black, green skin, wordy old hag, gained its popularity from The Wicked Witch of the West and the famed 1939 classic The Wizard of Oz. And ironically, the green skin was decided on because it looked suitably scary and otherworldly, and that it showed up well on the film. Like during the time when they were doing Technicolor, when color film, color movies were first coming into popularity, Technicolor picked up on the green very well, which is I think kind of interesting. So we have the great and powerful Oz to thank for that one. But previous representations of the witch were more of a red or orange face to give it more of a menacing look. The pointed hats were just what were in style during that time period. As like today, the fashions changed. However, those who lived further from the cities or kingdoms were not as informed to newer styles. It's just like they didn't have social media, they didn't have television, they didn't have the things like today. Stuff that's popular in the cities, like the cities were the more populated areas, so styles and trends and everything would move faster in the cities and the populated areas. Whereas once you get out into the remote areas, they could be, decades behind on what was considered trendy. So therefore, most of the rural people were not as up to date with the fashion and typically practiced or followed a pagan lifestyle. They weren't necessarily aware of or following like Christianity. So they would tend to stay more to like an earthbound pagan religion, where they didn't have the modernized medicines or what were considered modernized at the time. They would be more of the herbs and roots and natural remedies, which a lot of people then would consider like basically like a witch doctor, like hoodoo or whatever you want to call it, where they would make their own concoctions to cure people with their magic and whatnot. So anyways, so when the more educated Christians from the cities would encounter a rural pagan who was still donning a more dated attire, like the pointed hat, and relied more on the earthbound means of remedies, they were labeled as witches and were identified as such based on the hats that they wore, which is, pretty sad, really. And
which is kind of brings up an interesting point. A lot of these people from cities and from more educated backgrounds came to these earthbound remedy people for earthbound remedies.
right.
And then, these people weren't necessarily practicing witchcraft. They could have been going to a Christian church every Sunday and Wednesday and whatever days they had to go, Saturdays back then, I guess. They could have been doing all that, but their knowledge was basically, being an apothecary and early understanding of herbology and stuff like that. So a lot of these people were sought out, but then kind of labeled as being in league with the devil when it became suitable for these people to kind of distance themselves from the usage of these herbs, or these, or a specific village has come under, has been bewitched by this person in the next village over. So a lot of people, it is pretty sad that these people were really just kind of labeled as being in league with the devil, even though they were just really trying to help their fellow man and woman.
Yeah. They're so quick to accuse the lonely old woman who lived down the lane with her little cat, who was more or less, like you said, like an herbologist or almost like a chemist in their own way, where they knew through, probably heritage and generations of understanding what to utilize from the earth, and God forbid something goes wrong, you, like you said, they go to those people for whatever kind of an elixir, and it doesn't work the way it's supposed to, and the person dies. Well, she bewitched them, she cursed them, it was the witch, so they want in their mourning state, they want revenge, or they want some kind of
they want to blame somebody.
To kind of mask their pain. They want somebody else to suffer like they are, right? But and again, it's sad that people had to endure that, but back then people were naive and impressionable, and whenever something went wrong, it was easier to blame somebody, or to try and, for lack of better terms, try and sacrifice somebody else for the better good of the masses. So unfortunately, a lot of people were wrongly accused. But another thing, like with the witches, a lot of times they're depicted with the witch flies at Halloween night flies by the moon on her broomstick. Well, there's a couple theories on why or how the broomstick, the flying broomstick, came about. One theory on the broomstick is witches or pagans ingested hallucinogens when they perform some of their rituals, so that way they're in a more heightened state of mind to conduct their magic or their rituals. And some of these hallucinogenics, if taken orally, the people would vomit, they'd become violently ill. So instead, they took them by smearing the hallucinogens on the broomstick and inserting the broomstick in certain orifices to avoid getting sick and to be able to carry out the hallucinogenic trance. So they rode that broomstick in another way, I guess, if you think about it. But they got their high on, and they were really high on that broomstick. But another theory is during the light of the full moon, witches or pagans would hold harvest celebrations during the different rites or holidays that they believed in or that they followed or practiced. And they would run through the fields with a broom between their legs as if flying, and they would leap through the air. And the idea behind that was the higher they would jump, the higher the crops would grow. So however high that broomstick went parallel to the ground would be how high their crops would grow. So in a sense, it would produce a more bountiful harvest. So they weren't necessarily flying through the air as, it's depicted in a lot of movies and like Hollywood makes it out to be. They would more or less be, witnessed by, I don't know, somebody who thought it was strange and different. And then they said, oh, they were flying through the air and they were on their broomstick and yada, yada, yada. So then the story carries on and that's how it comes about. And just same kind of concept with the black cat. As we talked about before, people thought that witches kept black cats, and the black cat was actually the devil taking form of a familiar animal, and it would whisper into the witch's ear and trying to get the witch to do his evil deeds. Well, that's not necessarily true. I mean, witches, or I don't want to say witches, but people, pagans and Christians alike, back then there were a lot of rodent problems, which, incited a lot of plagues and whatnot. They kept all kind of cats, not necessarily black cats. They had cats of all kind of colors. And in some, beliefs, like some Wiccan beliefs, which we'll get into that later, people say that a witch has a familiar, which is basically an animal that connects to them through the soul, and they're kind of their spirit animal. And it could be anything. It doesn't necessarily have to be a cat. It could be well, I guess for lack of better reference, take Harry Potter, for example. When the kids first start going to Hogwarts, they all get some kind of an animal, like a familiar, which is basically the wizard or witch's spirit animal. Like Harry had the owl, and some kids had rats and all that stuff. So that's what the hell are you laughing at?
Didn't you once have a case of the Hogwarts?
I had genital Hogwarts once, but that was a long time ago. Anyway, that's that about the cat. So, you want to talk about modern witchcraft?
Actually, before we jump into modern witchcraft, let's actually discuss something that happened due to the cat being the devil and involved in witchcraft. Just to kind of have an idea, one of the popes or some high up cardinal in the Catholic religion back then basically had all the cats killed in an area. Well, what happened was the cats used to keep the rats, mice, and guinea pigs populations down, which kept the flea population down. And if anybody understands what the flea population has to do with the grand scheme of things, it led to the bubonic plague outbreaks because there were no cats to kill the guinea pigs, rats, and mice. which therefore became overpopulated, which overpopulated the number of fleas, which spread the bubonic plague. So basically, these cats and these people that were deemed witches, by the killing off of these cats, they basically unleashed the plague on, this whole, pretty much on the whole European continent at that point again.
Yeah.
So that's just a point of reference. Some of the people are saying, it's amazing how if you reword something or there's a different understanding of something, it becomes okay nowadays. And yet back then, these people were doing the exact same thing. And sometimes I feel like that story there, where we kill off cats, it leads to an outbreak of the plague. How much herbology and herbal medicines and natural treatments did we destroy when we decided to turn against these people, and knowledge that was lost by killing off and through the witch hunts and stuff like that? Because people got to realize it wasn't just, we're going to kill these people that we consider witches. We are going to burn everything that they have in their homes for fear that somebody else will pick it up and be able to get more powerful. Right. So a lot of this stuff that we lost a lot of technology, or not technology, but a lot of information over the years, which I feel is kind of, something that should be addressed by human society at some point. That yes, burning witches that we can't prove are really witches and aren't doing anything wrong is wrong. But we've also not only killed off a ton of science, a ton of knowledge by getting rid of these people. So I'll get off my soapbox now, and we'll start talking a little bit about modern witchcraft.
Oh,
so
no. That's still you. That's still you. I thought you were going to pass it to me and say, no, that's still your topic.
No, I want to talk a little bit about, the modern, what the modern equivalent of witchcraft is known as, Wicca, an alternative, an often preferred name for a religious contemporary of witchcraft. Many witches prefer to call themselves Wiccans rather than witches. They say they practice Wicca rather than witchcraft because the word does carry such a negative stereotype attached to witches and witchcraft. Mm-hmm. And, the term Wicca and Wiccan distinguishes practitioners of folk magic and other forms of witchcraft and sorcery. And it signifies an organized religion with a set of beliefs, tenets, laws, ethics, holidays, and rituals. Mm-hmm. Some Wiccans believe that Wicca is derived from an Old English term, Witta, which basically means counselor, or vise, which means, just wise person. Mm-hmm. Wiccan means to learn sorcery and to bewitch. Still another example, Old English term magic influences events. Wiccans, Wicca and Wicca are more appropriate terms for what they actually do. Mm-hmm. And, people say, like, when we're talking modern, we are talking very modern in the sense of human history. Mm-hmm. The modern history of Wicca, basically dates back to about 1936. Gerald Gardner is basically considered the father of Wicca in the mid 20th century. And basically, he was a retired civil servant, amateur anthropologist, so he had a broad familiarity with paganism and occultism. Basically, you got to realize in England, you have areas of England that basically have prehistoric temples and ruins and stuff like that that date back thousands of years that were used for pagan rituals, burials. I mean, they're basically churches that, a lot of your churches in the northern parts of England are built on the grounds that these temples and stone monoliths used to occupy.
Mm-hmm.
He claimed to have been initiated into a witches' covenant in New Hampshire.
No, New Forest, Hampshire,
Oh,
in the late 1930s.
okay. Intent on, and his intent was.
Sound it out. You could get it. You could get it.
We're going to have a story time at the end of this where Les is going to tell the story about the time he went to the party and saw the werewolf.
Oh, okay. That's after the next section.
Yeah, his intent was to perpetuate this craft. Gardner founded the Briquette Wooden Coven with his wife Donna in the 40s after buying 5-acre naturalist club, which I have two different meanings for in my head, so I'm not going to get into. And the club's early membership was drawn, and held meetings on the club grounds. So the witchcraft religion becomes more prominent beginning in the 1950s with the repeal of the Witchcraft Act of 1735, after which Gerald Gardner and others such as Charles Cardell and Cecil Williamson began publicizing their own versions of the craft. Gardner and others never used the term Wicca as a religious identifier, simply referring to the witch cult, witchcraft, and the old religion. Mm-hmm. However, Gardner did refer to witches as the Wick during the 1960s, and the name of the religion became more normalized to Wicca. Gardner tradition later themed Gardenism soon became the dominant form in England and spread to other parts of the British Isles. So you want to talk?
Good job! You made it through. You made it through.
You want to talk about that werewolf story?
Gardnerianism
is whatever
his branch of Wicca. And there's also Raymond Buckland, who was another kind of front runner in the Wiccan movement for modern witches. And a lot of this information we got from a pretty cool book. I don't know if you can see it. It's the Encyclopedia of Witchcraft, of Witches and Witchcraft. I don't know if you, where the hell, there we go. It's pretty cool. We got a lot of great information from that that book, as well as some other sources. So I just wanted to give props to that, which is kind of cool. But as far as you take the history of witchcraft, and it was evil, it was the work of the devil and this and that, and I wish I would have been a little bit more prepared, which I apologize. I had so much more stuff pop up before the show than I had anticipated. I had a plumber show up. I had a possible new client out in Ohio that I had to take time to talk to, and it was just a mess. But we had some cool illustrations that we wanted to bring up and show you guys, but unfortunately we won't be able to. But I could put them up on the Facebook page later if anybody care. Just let us know. But you take the history and how it was devil worship, it was evil, it was, and again, all propaganda from the church. And then you go to modern times now, where and Mike, a friend of ours, Mike Mansell, had mentioned in the chat in the comment section, where it's funny how back then people that used he says, so back then people used natural remedies and they were called witches, but people today use natural remedies and they're natural healers. It is strange how things kind of go full circle, where nowadays people are trying to almost revert or adopt the older, more natural means, because let's face it, everything today kills you. Your food, your water, products that you use, hell, even some of the chemicals that are in your clothing, everything kills you. So everybody's trying to look for a way to stay alive. So everybody's going back to where we should have stayed, is back to the earth, where everything was pure and natural, not man-made chemicals and toxins. But it's cool how things are being more accepted, and different laws are being put in place, which I think that Wicca is actually recognized as an actual religion in the United States military as well. So if you're a practitioner of the Wiccan religion, it's accepted in the military. I'm not saying you're not going to get made fun of, but it's accepted.
Yeah, it actually is an accepted religion now. And I think one of the things, like the thought of satanic worship and being in league with the devil, not saying that some of these people that were, tried for witchcraft, or, were considered witches or were hunted down as witches. And it's not saying that some of them weren't practicing black magic and being, trying to be in league with the devil. But there was a lot of people that were herbologists. You think about it. Basically, you go to your local, I'll use GNC because it's a national chain. You go to GNC, you buy a supplement that helps with your skin. You buy a supplement that helps with recovery or health and vitamins. Basically, a lot of that would have been at a certain point in time considered witchcraft.
Right.
The use of herbology and vitamins and combining them, that would have been, witchcraft. Now, again, like I said, not saying that some of these people that were tried and stuff like that were not in league with, practicing black magic and stuff like that. But, a larger majority of the people that were tried during witch trials had absolutely nothing to do with witchcraft or, Wicca, or any form that you want to give it. Some of these people were just pointed out by neighbors who just plain and simple didn't like their neighbor.
Yeah, or didn't want to be accused themselves. So it's safer to point a finger than to land on the chopping block. You take those witches up in Salem, or I don't want to say witches, the 9 women who were falsely accused in Salem. You know what I mean? They didn't do anything wrong. It's just like you said, it was mass hysteria, and people just started calling them out. And I guess what would, and I could be wrong in this, I'm just trying to go off of memory here. The one was taking fits, like seizures, and they thought that it was a result of a witch's curse. So that started almost the whole thing. And I think the only one, there were 9 women and 1 man, or was it 9 people in total? I can't remember his name, but there was an old man that got killed. The women were hung, and he was pressed to death by, they put a board over his body and just stacked it with stones and he was the only one who actually cursed them.
Yeah. I can't honestly remember the exact number of victims there, but you basically have what pretty much later gets, kind of forensically figured out to be ergot poisoning from the rye bread that they ate commonly there, is one theory on it. But there is one person involved in all the names that had knowledge of what would have been considered by Puritan society witchcraft, and that was Tituba, who was a servant to one of the families who had basically come from Africa and knew the African folk medicine and traditions,
Hmm.
and through the Caribbean and stuff like that had developed a knowledge of herbology and stuff like that. She is really the only one that, when you look at what the burden of proof would be on witchcraft, or this non-popular belief, she was the only one that would really have had knowledge of this stuff.
Right.
Not
It's
saying
funny.
that
Go ahead. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
not saying that the girls who were involved in stuff like that couldn't have been dabbling, but we're also talking about a society that lived under constant fear of Native American attacks,
Hmm.
and basically going outside at the wrong time of year could kill you.
And not
Drinking
to mention
water,
their own extreme fear of God.
yeah,
The Puritans were so religious that everything was wrong.
yeah.
So that, and combined with what you're saying, is just their environment wanted to kill them. The what do you want to call them? First Nations people, Native Americans. I don't know what the hell to call them now. It's politically correct.
I think acceptable is First Nations people
But you had
or
the First
Native
Nations,
American.
yeah, the First Nations people that inhabited that area when the Puritans arrived. They, their treaties were broke, so they wanted the people off their land. You had, disease, sickness, just so many elements. It's just a combination. So like you said, you had one person that might have had any kind of representable skill
Knowledge.
set, knowledge
Yeah.
that could be, you know what I mean, looked at as. And it's funny too that you mentioned that, because all throughout the world there's different forms of witches or conjurers, if you will. Like you have in Africa witch doctors, you have shamans in the Native American culture, you have witches in Britain, you have druids in Ireland, you have all these. But the similarity is, if you think about it, they were all viewed as these, otherworldly, ungodly people, but yet to Christians, or to people that of the church, they were viewed as these, devil worshiping whatnots. But if you think about it, they were technically more like doctors, more like your medical staff, if you will, your
Mhm.
you know what I mean, your medical practice. Everybody went to them because they were the ones that had the knowledge of the local flora and fauna and minerals and whatnot, and they knew what could cure and what could hurt you.
Yeah,
So
and you got to also look at a lot of the um, kingdoms and stuff like that, even after the conversion to to Christianity and stuff like that. A lot of those kingdoms still had somebody who was a mystic of some sort, a sorcerer of some sort, and they were protected by the kings and stuff like that, because the kings realized, like, oh, I have this open wound. He puts this paste on it. Uh, I don't die. My arm heals up. So let's get off of witches, because that kind of boils into a, you know, that could break down into a lot of different things, and I don't think that's what our
no,
Halloween is
we
about.
just wanted to kind of give a little bit of history and a future to present, or a past to present kind of depiction of what the witch is, and how it was related to, how it got to be what it is. And we had mentioned that, like, with the classic representation is from the Wizard of Oz. So the next creature that we want to move on to is werewolves. And what comes to mind when you hear that word? A tortured soul who tries frantically to lock themselves away from the light of the full moon and hopes to prevent harm to others. Their body painfully contorts itself into unnatural positions while the flesh peels away from their body to expose a thick coat of fur. Teeth and bones protrude to form a canine-like muzzle. The end result is a large bipedal half-man, half-wolf hybrid that will stop at nothing to quench its thirst for blood. I mean, even the word werewolf quite literally translates as man-wolf. Another term used to describe a werewolf is lycanthrope, or wolf person, and the act of the transformation is known as lycanthropy, which is the ability to shapeshift into a wolf or wolf-like creature. Now, the mythology or folklore of the werewolf dates back for centuries. However, it did gain more notoriety in the medieval Europe, that, as with most folklore and beliefs, had to do with Christian interpretation or reinterpretation, developed more during the medieval period. The werewolf belief actually ran parallel to the belief in witches, ironically, and witchcraft. This is, and its associated folklore was, in fact, part of the witch hunt craze that swept through Europe as well as the developing New World in America. So, as you can imagine, this led to the led to the mindless slaughter and decimation of basically the entire wolf population in Europe, and it was starting in the New World as well, and resulting in the extinction of the species in many of those places too. Not to mention the murder of innocent people who were, wrongly accused of being a werewolf. But there are many theories as to how, someone could be transformed into a werewolf. The most popular is that you would have to be bitten by either a wolf or a werewolf that carries the strain or the curse of, the lycanthropy or the lycanthrope. And on the night of a full moon, you would be transformed into the beast and would know nothing of, the yearning for blood. When you come to the next day, you wouldn't remember really nothing at all or anything at all while in the wolf form or in the werewolf form.
Yeah,
Dude.
I mean,
it's like a bad trip or a drinking binge when you wake up the next day. You're like, man, what happened?
When you're reading that, all I could think of is the old 1939 or whatever it is, Wolfman. When the wolfbane's in bloom and the moon is full, you shall turn. That basic. So, I don't know if anybody's ever seen the show Being Human. They did an American version and they had a British version of it. And the werewolf transformations were always so funny because it would be like a whole group of men and women just waking up in the woods in this one little park out of the way. And they'd all wake up in the woods, naked. And they'd all just kind of look at each other and they'd all pick up a thing of chicken that was they tied to a tree wherever they fell or something like that. And they'd always put a chicken and they'd just start eating because it took so much out of them. So that kind of was popping through my head. The guy's name, basically, Being Human was a ghost, a vampire, and a werewolf living in a home together.
I was ask if that was the one that you're talking about. That is actually a pretty good show. And go ahead.
I preferred the BBC version of it to the American version, but the American version was good too.
Yeah. Did you ever see the movie? I want to say it was called What Happens in the Shadows or We're in the Shadows or something. It's a vampire comedy. It's about
those three vampires that
live together. They're actually, I think I want to say there's four of them, and one of them, what the frick was his name? Teddy or something like that, but it was basically like Nosferatu.
Yeah.
Like they that old, spindly, and he lived in the basement, and then they're out walking around the one time and they're just talking to the camera crew that was following them. And then they run into a pack of werewolves and they're smack talking each other. Oh my God. If I have to look that up when we get to the next topic, I'll look that up and I'll put the link out there. It is the funniest freaking movie. Oh my God.
Yeah, I do remember that one. It's like In the Shadows or something like that. It's called, but it actually reminded me.
Go ahead.
That was reminded me of Being Human, but it was all vampires living together.
Yeah, and it's
Uh,
funny as hell. But you know, it's funny when you had mentioned the old 1930s werewolf. That actually is what kicked off the idea of when a person would shapeshift or transform into a werewolf, a quote werewolf. Um,
mhm.
Traditionally, according to folklore, when one became a werewolf or when one was a werewolf, or thought to be, you wouldn't transform into a half man, half beast. You would transform into just a wolf.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until that 1930s The Wolfman movie came out where it was a half man, half wolf. So I mean, technically, what we think of a werewolf now isn't what it is traditionally. So I just thought that was an interesting little tidbit there. But
Yeah, remind me. I have a story to tell about that.
sure, yeah,
Uh,
yeah.
in
So give
ancient
a little bit
Greece,
of, a little bit more history. I'm gonna see if I can
yeah,
look up that movie.
yeah. Just basically, like, kind of give you some ideas of how one becomes a werewolf. You know, it was believed in ancient Greece a person could be transformed by eating the mixture of wolf and human meat, and that the condition was irreversible at that point.
Mm-hmm.
Centuries later, other methods were, said to create werewolves, included the old gypsy's curse, being conceived under a new moon, having eaten certain herbs. So, you got to be careful when you have Kentucky Fried Chicken that one of those 11 herbs and spices isn't the certain herb and spice.
I know. I turn into a beast when I eat that stuff. I know that.
Yeah. Here's the best one, I think. By sleeping under the full moon on a Friday. That,
Mm,
that's very specific for, and very odd for, of all things, full moon Friday. Got to be a werewolf.
yeah, yeah.
Um, Here's another one: drinking water that has been touched by a wolf.
Hmm.
Um, we all possibly could have drank water that has been touched by a wolf. If you think about
So, enlighten me.
it, it rains in the mountains.
Mm-hmm.
There are wolves in mountains.
Right.
The wolf goes to the stream to drink.
Mm-hmm.
He touches the water. Water disperses, comes down the mountain to the water plant. It's pumped into your plant, to your home. You drink, you bathe, you use it to cook, clean, whatever. Then you flush it or dump it outside where it either goes back into the environment via the transfer of water vapor back into the sky, or you dump it down the toilet, flush it, it goes to a water plant, it gets treated and goes back into the river.
God, that's deep.
Yeah, I'm just saying. I mean,
Then we're
if
all
you're gonna have,
werewolves.
yeah, I mean, if you're gonna have something so specific that is a werewolf, that centuries old curse of, well, if you touched or drank water that was touched by a wolf, that again is really specific and very subject to interpretation.
Right. It's like,
I mean,
remember that time?
hunters spray.
What's that?
I was going to say hunters use like fox urine. So,
That's true. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You
do
never
you
know.
turn into fox man?
So true. So true.
Ooh. So, we're kind of making light of this, folks, and again, it is our Halloween. It's the big Halloween monsters. Um, this is not in depth coverage of these subjects, and just kind of get into the human persecution and response to these myths is interesting as a society. Persecution of werewolves and associated folklore is an integral part of the witch hunt phenomenon. It's a small part of it. The accusation of being a werewolf or being involved in some small faction of cases in the witch trials. And, it wasn't just accusations of being able to turn into a wolf, but it was mixed with the accusations of riding wolves or wolf charming. Um, Actually, I'm not sure if one of my friends is still watching right now, um, but he was a canine handler with police departments and a dog trainer who actually trained me and I worked with a lot. Um, he could train a wolf to do all the things that, that you'd want your wolf to be able to do. This guy could do it.
Mm-hmm.
So back then, that would be considered part of the witch trials and would be in the realm of, witchcraft and being a werewolf or lycanthropy. The ability to train that animal would be considered witchcraft or, lycanthropy.
Mm-hmm.
There's a case of like Peter Stump from 1589, um, which led to a specific peak in both interest in and persecution of supposed werewolves, primarily in the French speaking and German speaking parts of Europe. The phenomenon persisted for a long time in Bavaria and Austria, with the persecution of wolf charmers recorded until well after 1650, and the final case taking place around the early part of the 18th century in those parts of the world. After basically after the witch trial phenomenon ends, um, the werewolf becomes a very interested part of folklore studies, and the emergence of gothic horror genre in Europe leads to werewolf fiction as a genre. It's pre-modern predecessors in the medieval romance novels and stuff like that, and the development of the um, 18th century out of semi-fictional chap book tradition. Uh, trappings of horror literature in the 20th century, like we're talking the Wolfman and stuff like that, and even the fantasy genre and modern pop culture have embraced the werewolf, or the different forms of the werewolf and lycanthropy and curses and stuff like that. Um, it was also widely believed that werewolves could dress. This is very interesting because this kind of ties back to our last show. They could dress. They would actually dress in a protective wolf skin and remove it at daybreak and hide it. If their magical pelt was found and taken from the werewolf when it was in human form, he or she could be killed. Um, I said this ties into our previous episode. If you think about the Selkies, the story I tell about the Selkies in that episode, Selkies were seals that could transform into human form. And there was the story I told where the female Selkie was sunbathing. The man crept up, stole her skin, and she was forced to marry him and stay in human form. And eventually she, tricked him, stole her skin back, and then disappeared back into the ocean. So, that's a similarity. It's another shape shifting type, creature or feature of these creatures.
Right. Well, there's a lot of different kind of lore of shape shifting, not just people that turn into wolves or werewolves or anything like that, but like Chad had pointed out there's people that could shift into um, other kind of animals, and just kind of to go back to the vampire section is the vampire was thought to be able to change shape into different animals like the bat, the wolf, and so on and so forth. But there's also been Native American lore about skinwalkers, which is probably
Mhm.
a more common or a more widely known legend, if you will. And skinwalkers are people that possess the ability to transform from a human into a beast. Some say it was the work of a witch or a shaman that would summon the skinwalker to do their evil bidding. Those who are affected by the skinwalker run the risk of becoming one themselves. And there's also the lore of the Rougarou or the Loup-garou in southern Louisiana. These stories are generally old and mirror the werewolf stories from Europe, with a few differences from, the Wolfman. But seeing as the wolf is not native to Louisiana, the creature in the lore are often replaced with either, cattle, dogs, pigs, and are usually white in color. The story goes that the Rougarou will wreak havoc to anyone or anything it encounters until, someone brave enough is able to kill it. It will turn back into its original form right before, I should say, the dying blow. Jesus, I am losing my train of thought. Right before it takes its last breath, it would reveal to its attacker it's who he is, and the attacker can't speak of the event, or the person being attacked can't speak of the event for an entire year, or that person will then become the Loup-garou or will be cursed. So we talked about ways to kill vampires, and now we'll talk about ways to kill a werewolf. And there are a few ways to kill a werewolf, and the most popular is obviously with a silver bullet, and really anything made from silver would kill a werewolf. But according to a passage in Constantino's book, Werewolves, the Occult Truth, it's actually a pretty cool book. I don't know. Pretty neat, pretty cool book about werewolves and kind of the history of. But a passage in Constantino's book says that in 1640, the first recorded instance of silver being used to kill a werewolf resulted from an epidemic that plagued the city of Greifswald. Although there is no way to validate the account of these passed down stories, the local legends say the town was infested with the creatures, with werewolves outnumbering the townspeople. Granted, the tale was not recorded until 200 years later. It is astounding that an event allegedly took place. For a reason lost to legend, a group of students were the ones who fought back, and not too well, mind you, until one of them got the idea to try to use a silver bullet as a means to kill them, which worked and lent its hand to the folklore for centuries to come. However, there are other ways to kill a werewolf as well, and also to cure lycanthropy. You could torture and burn the accused while in human form. However, it was not tested or proven to work while in wolf form because nobody's really ever caught a werewolf. There was also the means of exorcism. It was believed that the devil had part to do with a person being cursed with lycanthropy, so the church tried to conduct exorcisms in an attempt to exorcise the demon spirit from the body. Elliot O'Donnell described in his book in 1912 werewolves of this method. The ritual involves creating a 7-foot magical circle related to Mercury and containing planetary symbols of the essence drawn around the perimeter. Mercury was used because it's believed to be the most bitter opponent to evil spirits. The ritual goes on to suggest that using mixtures of different things like minerals, roots, and even living creatures such as snakes and toads, and was then performed by a priest or a priestess. We're not sure if it worked or not, but it's all part of the lore, amongst others, to cure lycanthropy. Just some fun little facts there.
Yeah.
Or I don't want to say facts, but stories.
Yeah. So there are, several medical conditions. We always like to try to break this down, to give reasonable, rational explanations for a lot of things people claim over the years. Mm-hmm. One of them is hypertrichosis, which is basically the unusual long hair of the face, body. They actually had a guy, it was on one of the Monster Quest or one of those shows. He was a Mexican acrobat who has this condition, and basically all the hair grows on your face. It just basically grows in, and you basically end up covered in hair, through most of your body. Naturally males have more, hair, but the facial structure and all would be covered with hair. And it's been around, it's been diagnosed. I know Les had, said about some of the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus possibly had 2 twin acrobats that had this condition.
Yeah, I'm trying to work on getting some of those photos up here. So, like
Yeah.
Chad said, it's oh dang, where's it at? I'm not having much luck with it, guys. Well, I put some pictures on our Facebook page. So if you go in and check that out, it's in the All Hallows Eve album. There's a picture of the kids that Chad's talking about, from the Ringling Brothers, or a circus back in the day. They have well, you could go on, but they're all. I have a bunch of pictures out there. Some pictures of skinwalkers, some old depictions of wood engravings of witches dancing with devils, and so on and so forth. And
now
try to get
a second condition that could kind of would give some of the characteristics now is porphyria, which is characterized as an extreme sensitivity to light, thus encouraging the victim to only go out at night. Some of the side effects of it, though, are seizures, anxiety, and some other symptoms. This has also been one of the things, like in vampire folklore, if you thought of, basically a medical condition that would, kind of lead to some of this, this would be one of them with the extreme light sensitivity. There are other conditions that cause your skin to react, basically giving you a terrible sunburn. So if you're looking at the vampire, the sunlight burns their flesh. These type of extreme light sensitivity could actually cause basically like sunburns that are on the level of chemical burn. Just in these conditions alone, now these conditions are also rare. They don't turn people into werewolves. They were just beliefs, they're always associated with witches, vampires, and magic and all this stuff. But these are real conditions that people suffer from. Now, think about if you go back to the early 1500s and stuff like that, we medically have a name for this. We medically understand the condition, the genome that creates the condition, the possible treatments and stuff like that for these conditions. Right. These are people who did not have an understanding of this of medicine to that level. So now you have somebody who has hair growing all over their face, filling in under their eyes, above their eyes, all the way up to their forehead. There's no hairline. It's all facial hair.
You're person
again, what's that?
I said, you're getting there.
I shaved out here today and stuff like that. It does.
But if you didn't,
it does get up to about here nowadays.
I know.
But if you saw somebody like that, without an understanding that this is a medical condition, you saw them at night traversing through the woods. Mm-hmm. There's a werewolf in our area. Now, this person would be hunted down and probably killed, for being a werewolf. Nowadays, we would look at it and be like, he's got a medical condition that causes extreme facial, hair growth and body hair growth. And we know it's gene blah, blah, blah in this sequence that causes this condition, and his family is genetically predispositioned for it, and all that stuff. People back then wouldn't know that. They would have no
Right.
concept of that. So, you know, this, medical conditions over, history that people didn't understand or couldn't diagnose. It's kind of back like we talked about dinosaur skeletons, that washed up because of flooding and stuff like that around rivers. And people thought, oh, we have some kind of monster because here's a skeleton of one of its, kinfolk that is sitting there. So there's got to be a monster in this lake.
Right.
We have people with medical conditions. We have to have monsters. Kind of sad.
Yeah.
But
well, people fear what they don't know. It's been like that from day one, and it's still like that now. I mean, look at little kids. I mean, I have 2 young kids. You have kids. When they see something that they don't know, they have no explanation for. They're terrified. They don't know what to think. You know what I mean? And
yeah.
if they don't have somebody to turn to and say, "What's wrong with that?" Especially my youngest, Jesus, she's just like me. She has no filter. Like, she'll sit there and she'll just say, "What's wrong with that person?" You know what I mean? Like, they don't know. Back then people were, well, most of the people weren't as educated, and they weren't, they were a lot more naive and, susceptible to folklore. It's scary. I mean, shit, Jesus, there's stuff today I see. I take a step back. I'm like, what the hell, So,
I mean, if I saw somebody walking around with hypertrichosis, I would be a little alarmed at first.
Yeah, I'd be staring. Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, you're gonna be like, well, that's different.
I mean, well, we grew up in an area where, the WWF at the time used to run a lot of shows and events in that area. And Andre the Giant, the first place, I don't care what anybody ever says, the first place Andre the Giant was slammed by Hulk Hogan was the Hamburg Fieldhouse in 1979. This whole WrestleMania thing, it's a complete lie. There's videotape of him being slammed in 79 at the Hamburg Fieldhouse. But there was a person, Andre the Giant, who was 7'4", probably about 500 pounds on a good day, who had a medical condition that made him that big. People stared at him, even though he didn't really look different than most people, except for the fact of he was 7'4", 525 pounds. So that's a normal looking person with a condition. People stare. So yeah, I would say, I've met 7-footers before. A couple of our friends are 6'6", 6'7". One of them happens to look like a Wookiee, but we're not going to call Schaefer out on that. Hi, Schaefer. I saw you were on watching earlier. But yeah, these medical conditions over, 200, 300, 400 years ago, a 7-foot tall, I mean, Maximus Thrax, who was a Roman emperor, was supposedly 8 foot tall. He was looked at as a freak, and yet he was the emperor of Rome.
Right.
He was nearly, if not over 8 foot tall. So, yeah, definitely some of these medical conditions make people kind of look at other people or would indicate monster in a lot of people's mind. Thanks for letting me ramble there for so long, Les, without jumping in to save me.
Oh, no, that's fine. I was just nodding off there.
Taking a nap. Taking a nap like normal. Okay, well, you got anything to add to this since you let me ramble and just kind of let me hang there for a minute?
No, not really. I mean, I think we covered all the bases there for the big three there for Halloween.
Actually, Mike actually brought up an interesting question. I don't think with technology and knowledge of technology back then, witches would have been trial. We wouldn't have had witch trials and stuff like that. Um, but I still think vampires, even in the world we live in nowadays, people still attack people under the claim of vampirism. It's still a very touchy subject in some of Europe. Even in Africa, even though we didn't really touch on any African versions of the vampiristic legends, there are people who have been killed for the insinuation of them being vampires. You also got to realize there's a lot of diseases in Africa that are bloodborne. So, yes, I still think vampires would be an issue. Werewolves, I don't think so, because with the understanding of technology and the knowledge we have nowadays, I don't think werewolves would be something people would go after, because werewolves are really similar to the idea of Sasquatches and stuff like that, where people would probably be more than likely trying to protect creatures like that if they existed. So yeah, I don't think witches would have had as hard of a time. I do still think people with vampirism, because it's the taking of life that's involved in that, that would still be an issue in certain parts of the world.
Yeah, I don't think it would be as widespread as it was, had we known then what we know now. I mean, as far as like the supernatural aspect of it, I still, but like you said though, like there's still some sensitive areas. I remember a few years ago, I was up in Salem, Massachusetts the one time, and there's actually, we took a tour, and they actually told us. Now I don't know if it was just BS from the tour or not, but I actually heard a few people talk about it while I was up there, that I guess there are groups up there that, I mean, obviously there's people that practice witchcraft that flock to Salem just because of the history. But there's also a lot of people that practice vampirism, and supposedly there's a coven up there, and they said that they warned people not to go out too much at night and stay out of dark alleys, because people were being abducted, and they were thinking it was these cult groups or these covens that were taking people off, to do their vampiric practice, which I thought was kind of funny. You think, shit like that wouldn't happen nowadays, but there's nutty people out there, and I could definitely
Yeah.
see that, because there was a reporter, I remember seeing on one of these TV shows about strange things. There was a reporter, I want to say she was in New York City, and she was doing an investigation into, I guess there was a boom in vampire followers or whatever, and she was trying to get the
Neo-vampirism.
scoop on it. Yeah, if you will. And she was trying to get the scoop on that, and I guess she got too deep, and she ended up vanishing. She disappeared. Nobody was able to find her.
Were you watching Lost Tapes again?
I don't think it was Lost Tapes. I want to say it was on
Okay, because
History.
that just reminded me of the Lost Tapes episode about vampires and stuff like that. But no, there is like a neo vampirism culture out there. In fact, as much as I don't really want to go there, but on Ghost Adventures this weekend, one of the guys they brought in was the bishop of the vampiristic group in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
And basically he runs the masquerade ball for the vampires in New Orleans.
Mm-hmm.
Are there people out there that do this stuff? Yes. Are there people that practice black magic? Yes. Will they abduct people, from dark streets? I think that goes back to my original razor blades and candy thing. Um, Anybody who knows the actual story about the razor blades and candy will know the only time that anybody has the origin story to this. The child's father was the one that killed him with the razor blades and the candy. It was not a neighbor. It had nothing to do with strange people in your neighborhood. It was the child's own parent that killed him. But yet we all grew up under the fear of, oh, you got to x-ray your candy. And statistically, there is very little that's ever actually truly happened with candy. We also grew up in the generation of look out for the van with the dragon on the side of it because they're abducting kids in the neighborhood. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania. We must have had 37 different vans that were, roving Schuylkill County, abducting children. One had a white van with a dragon on it. One was a black van with a dragon with a warrior on it. I think a lot of that is the what?
Remember the gypsies? Back when we were younger, there were those quote gypsies that were going around the area, and they would
steal kids.
They'd walk in your house and steal your crap because to them it was, there was no such thing as possession. What was there was for all, and they were going house to house and ripping people off. Like if somebody came home, they walked in, they saw a gypsy standing there with a bag full of their crap, and the gypsy was unfazed. They just walked out and got in their gypsy van and left.
I honestly, I do remember something about gypsies, but the fact that we just basically said they saw a gypsy because gypsies wear uniforms to break into houses. I am a gypsy. Yeah. It's so funny.
That was the thing that I was always curious about when I was little. I was like, what's a gypsy? What do they look like? Is it like, when you see in like the medieval where they're with the metal embellished outfits with the long dresses, they dance around with their little covered wagons and whatnot.
I was going to say, I always just pictured the wagons and the ruffled shirts and stuff. Basically the gypsies from the Wolfman. Like that's who I pictured.
Yeah, the
gypsies
fortune tellers.
being.
Yeah.
So every time they said be on the lookout for gypsies, I'm like, they should be the easiest people to spot. They're horse-drawn carriages.
I know.
How can we not catch them? But yeah, I mean, I think a lot of stuff when it comes to these stories about the, they're going to abduct you if you're on a dark street in Salem. I want to see one police report that actually says that somebody attempted an abduction on a street in Salem. I think you'd have better odds of getting robbed in a dark alleyway in Salem because they know you're a tourist. They know you probably have tourist money with you. So it means you have more than the average guy walking out of a restaurant.
Right, you're out of your comfort zone. You're out of your familiar area. You don't have anybody around who's gonna, recognize you.
So I think they just kind of tell you that there's vampires lurking, and all I could picture is the vampires from Nosferatu anyway, just kind of standing there being like, with its little nails clicking together. I'm sorry, I absolutely love Shadow of a Vampire, which was the movie made about the making of Nosferatu. It had Willem Dafoe in it, and he would just sit there and clack his nails together. You remember my Nosferatu phase where I had the doll, the poster, your
bedroom was painted black. You had an alligator.
Painted black, pet alligator. Nosferatu phase had the actual Nosferatu. I wish I still had it because I'd have it behind me here. But the big movie poster from Nosferatu.
Oh man, excuse me. I would say that the best or the creepiest depiction of a vampire the Nosferatu, that what do you call it? The silent movie film, dude. There is nothing creepier than that thing.
Yeah, and all that was really a ripoff of Dracula, Bram Stoker's Dracula. It was just rewritten in such a way to avoid copyright issues.
Mm-hmm.
But to me, that's the scary vampire.
Yeah.
I have to relay a story. It's late in the show, and probably there's only a few people watching that can make fun of me for this later. I've always been a big fan of vampires. Grandpa on the Munsters, Grandpa Al Lewis, who is the vampire grandpa. Dracula, all those vampire stories. I've always been, it's kind of one of those things I've always been interested in. Not in drinking people's blood, but the whole like legendary creature who lives forever and is kind of tortured because of being able to live forever. And my mother dressed every year for the first probably until I was probably about 7, about 8. I always did Count Dracula for Halloween. The little cape with the white shirt with the little like red ruby fake plastic medallion, the fangs, the hair slicked back when it was still actually black and not like graying out and everything. And I didn't have the big, beard.
Don't stop your story.
First of all, Twilight is not really vampires. Twilight is the Brokeback Mountain of vampire stories. But the slick back hair and they used to do at the Cursona Borough Hall, they would do like the face painting, the Halloween face painting for kids. So she takes me, gets my face painted with the white paint and darkens around the eyes and all this stuff and puts little like drops of blood by my mouth. So it's Halloween. I get home, I go look in the mirror, and I start screaming for her to take it off because I was scared of my own reflection.
You're so lame. Count Chadula scared himself.
Yeah, well, I was a kid. At least I don't watch Harry Potter and pretend it's real, okay? Do we want to really get there?
It isn't real?
No, Les, it's not real, buddy. Those Hogwarts that you had that time were.
My anal Hogwarts.
But
well, yeah, we covered them. The big 3.
Yeah, well,
I think eventually down the line we'll probably end up having individual shows on each topic and much more in depth. Especially, especially about Twilight, since everybody seems to be really wanting to.
Yeah, we got to definitely cover Twilight and all the ins and outs of the rewriting of a whole genre of creatures to fit. Well, actually, 2 genres of creatures, and it's sad that I know this. I've seen one of the Twilight movies.
I saw,
but we're gonna wear sparkles when we do that, though, right?
Mm-hmm. Glitter.
Probably do the show shirtless.
Yes.
Okay.
No,
but we do actually plan on covering. Les, the werewolf story.
No, I'm not going to tell the werewolf story.
It's a joke, folks. I'll one of these days fill you in on Les's werewolf story.
I think if I said the werewolf story, I think I would lose any little bit of credibility I had from anyone. So I can't tell the wolf story.
We do actually plan on covering some cases like the Highgate vampires and stuff like that, which are more where we'll go a little more in depth on the topics of vampires and stuff like that, and a little more on some of the history and stuff that goes along with these cases. Werewolves will cover a little bit in some different forms and stuff like that. Come on, Les, you gotta tell the werewolf story.
I can't. I can't. It's too
Okay, well,
painful.
so I think I'm at a good place to say goodnight to everybody.
Mm.
But yeah, I'd like to thank my co-host Les for doing such a great show.
Hmm.
We the Explorers would also like to thank our audience, especially tonight. You guys have been super cool with throwing up comments
Hmm.
and asking questions, even if some of them kind of threw us off at points. But that's awesome. It's
I
great to
can't
have you
believe
guys.
Mike Mansell is on there, man. I haven't seen that guy in forever. He was always such a cool dude. So thanks, Mike,
Yeah,
for stopping by. I actually think I saw Mike at the Orgsburg Halloween parade, but I wasn't sure if it was him or not, so I didn't want to say anything. But
yeah,
thanks, Mike. I'm glad you glad you stopped by, bud.
yeah. Yeah, it's cool actually getting to see some of you guys popping up here and throwing up some comments and asking some questions. And, so I'd like to thank you guys personally, the audience for coming along with us on this trip. It's kind of silly. This is how the show is. We are silly. We're going to talk about goofy stuff. Um, you know, there's times where we will be serious when presenting stuff. But, we like to have fun with it. It's not, we don't want to bore you to death with. And then in 1862, the happened and werewolf.
Yeah.
We want you to have fun with us. We want to have fun with you guys. So, again, I'd like to thank my co-host Les.
Yep. Thanks. Well, I would like to thank you as well, Mister Count Chadula, for being my best friend and co-host. And definitely, like Chad has said,